Emmett St. Clair Watson Jr. was born the second of 7 children in 1893 in Richmond, Virginia, where his father worked as a manager for a wood and coal fuel company. At the age of only 13, Emmett left school and took a job with a local engraving company, and within a couple of years his cartoons were being published in the Richmond Times-Dispatch newspaper, but unfortunately no usable evidence from this period exists. The earliest published work of decent quality I could find is this duotone cover illustration for Buick's in-house magazine in 1916, and another more painterly example for Home Life magazine a year later. His budding career as an illustrator was interrupted in 1917 when the USA joined their European allies in the war against Germany, and Watson served in the army as a cartographer in the battlefields of France. Once the war was over, he returned to the USA and relocated to New York, where he set up his own freelance practice in a studio in Manhattan. Most of his work at this time was produced for magazines including Judge and Life, and at this point his images for interior pages continued to be printed as monochrome only. Most of these were what could fairly be described as representational and tonally rendered, but he also produced a group of remarkably modernist figure illustrations for an unknown magazine, and this equally uncharacteristic pen and ink cartoon about the passing of prohibition into law. At the turn of the decade, he also began creating duotone cover illustrations such as these examples from Leslie's magazine. And in 1920 he produced what appears to have been his first full-colour image for this sheet music cover, which was also used as a cover for Judge. So, with his career prospects now looking quite promising, in 1921 Watson married Marguerite Marie Elliott, and their son Emmett Watson III was born in 1922. He was followed 3 years later by their daughter Margie. Alongside ongoing work for his magazine clients, Watson also began creating press advertising for Remington typewriters, among which was this duotone printed example. There was also some full-colour point-of-sale work for the watch and clockmakers Ingersoll. But it was undoubtedly magazine work which constituted the bulk of his output, and in the early 1920s Watson began a productive and enduring professional association with the magazine The American Legion Weekly, where his visually eloquent and occasionally light humorous cover images were printed again as duotone in the ever-popular combination of the period in black and red or orange. It was with this body of images with which he began to establish a reputation as one of the most descriptive, figurative and frequently light humorous illustrators of the period, alongside older, more established figures such as Norman Rockwell and Joseph Francis Kernan. I also found one solitary example of a cover from 1925 in full colour, but if there were others I couldn't find them. He continued to be a regular page illustrator too, in which capacity he created this solemn image to accompany the poem titled The Rouge Bouquet, written by his former company sergeant and writer Joyce Kilmer in honour of their dead war comrades. In 1927, Watson produced some energetic line-only monochrome page illustrations for the Pulp magazine Adventure, but the bulk of his output continued to be for the glossier, more reputable magazines, some of which were increasingly featuring his lightly humorous painted work in full colour on their covers. Nevertheless, he returned to Adventure in 1929, this time around as the cover artist. This was also the year in which the Watson family moved to Scarsdale, New York, and he first worked for the trade magazine The Progressive Grocer. Like the earlier covers for the American Legion, these were printed as duotone, and Watson again made the limitations of duotone print work to his advantage with his good-natured images of everyday Americana. But the 1930 stock market crash and the financial turmoil that followed led to many magazines experiencing straitened times, when advertisers no longer took out space in their pages. Watson's client base didn't completely evaporate, and for a while at least he continued with his covers for the Progressive Grocer, and even picked up a new similar client, the equally esoteric trade magazine Good Hardware, for whom he produced yet more cheerful everyday scenarios. There was even an apparently solitary Thanksgiving cover for Collier's magazine, and a handful of colour illustrations of rosy-cheeked children for Parents magazine. In 1932 he also created this particularly appealing cover for Life, a magazine whose days would soon be numbered in the Depression. But Watson needed more income than these commissions provided to stay afloat in this difficult period, and turned increasingly to pulp magazines, initially in the form of Railroad Man's magazine and Railroad Stories, with some dramatically painted colour covers and many pen and ink monochromes for their pages. And around the same time he began creating covers for racier detective-themed pulp magazines too. But there were other less frequent commissions in the form of a series of Western novel book covers by Robert Ames Bennett, revealing a previously unseen facility for highly romanticised but stirring images of cowboys. Like the majority of his pulp and magazine contemporaries, Watson generally favoured the use of oil paint, which he applied energetically in saturated vivid colours in his originals, and his paintings were far larger, sometimes by more than 300% of the printed size. His success with Western-themed illustration was particularly useful in the large volume of covers he produced for Argosy, which by the middle of the decade frequently featured his work on their covers. His confident drawing style, bold compositions and saturated colour were immensely popular with the magazine and its readers, and influenced the painted techniques of other younger illustrators who would also create pulp covers. Despite the Depression, pulp magazines such as Argosy did very well, as unlike the glossy magazines, they didn't rely on advertising and made their profits simply from numbers sold. And Watson quickly became a frequent contributor, especially with cover work. Because Argosy wasn't subject-specific, Watson was able to roam freely across a wide range of themes, all of which could loosely be gathered under the collective broad category of adventure stories. Consequently, his images explored historic periods and geographic locations from cover to cover, for which he used his large collection of reference books. His figure work was based on drawings of whoever he could find to pose for him, including family members, and he even appeared himself quite frequently in various guises in many of the paintings. There was still occasional work for others, including the progressive grocer, and more cover work for Western novels, but by the later 1930s, pulps were providing him with the bulk of his income. Of the pulp titles, Railroad Stories continued to be a regular client. But in 1937, Watson created a series of compelling covers for Double Detective magazine, featuring close-quarter female subjects either in peril or as femme fatale. They were quickly followed by the similarly inclined Detective Fiction Weekly, which became by far the most frequent home for his creative output. Quite a few of these dramatically realised covers featuring gun-wielding gangsters and resolute heroic detectives in mortal combat made use of the illustrative device known as a composite layout, which was also frequently used in many movie posters of the period. This would involve the artful combination of various iconic elements and characters arranged to form an image suggestive of the general tone and contents of the magazine, rather than a full scene of a particular moment from a story. As a weekly publication, the demands Detective Fiction Weekly made on Watson's time were considerable, and up to 1940 he was undoubtedly the artist most closely associated with this particular title. And although he naturally enough relied on certain compositional approaches, such as the composite, Watson nevertheless continued to bring the changes from cover to cover, and always succeeded in luring the reader in with the suggestion of thrills and spills to be found in the issue's contents. And even if he had only turned to pulps out of necessity, and with reluctance, it never showed in the quality of the large volume of cover images he produced. Nevertheless, there were other commissions, including more book cover work for Western novels by Robert Ames Bennett, and some of a similar nature for the writer Amos Moore. By the later 1930s, the economy in America had largely recovered from the Depression, and Watson was also returning increasingly to work for the glossy magazines, including a couple of covers for the prestigious Saturday Evening Post, the usual domain of Norman Rockwell. It was at this time he converted his earlier pen and ink drawing for Joyce Kilmer's Rouge Bouquet poem to a splendid commemorative painting. And in 1941, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the USA went to war again. Now too old to fight, he continued to produce cover art, although his last pulp covers were published in 1942. In their place, he had acquired a totally new and reliable client in the form of the Toronto Evening Star's weekly magazine. These full-colour cover paintings consisted of largely upbeat, emotionally charged studies of the fighting forces from the Allied nations. There were some battle scenes, or at least images of valiant young men in battle poses, but others portrayed more close-quarter intimate scenes with equal success. All of these illustrations were designed to reinforce the reader's resolve and patriotism, and he left the vilification of the enemy to others. In addition to the covers, he also created quite a large volume of interior page illustration too, much of which was also printed in colour. Towards the end of the conflict, Watson's paintings appeared on quite a few patriotic commercial calendars, and he also created a few covers for Liberty magazine at this time, which displayed considerable dignity and compassion for those serving their country and risking their lives. This dramatic evocation of Liberty herself, created in 1945, reveals the shortcomings of the print process when compared with the oil-painted original. But other than this celebration of victory for the progressive grocer and another Liberty cover in 1946, it seems that the only magazine work Watson produced was a series of page illustrations for railroad stories, and they stopped around 1950. Instead, he turned increasingly to wildlife paintings and scenes of hunting and fishing illustrations, which were widely reproduced in calendars and sold in prints to hang on the walls of American homes. Some of these were very accomplished and atmospheric wildlife art, while others featured comic interplay between hunters and grizzly bears. These latter humorous works constituted a popular series in themselves. He never returned to the pulps, which were by now themselves starting to fall out of favour, and it was with the production of such painted images that he was occupied in later life. And Emmett Watson died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of only 62 in New Canaan, Connecticut in 1955. Despite the popularity of his work, Watson never attained the level of success achieved by some of his better-known contemporaries, and like quite a few others whose main income was derived from pulp magazine work, he remained somewhat sidelined by the cult status of that genre. When making this video, I was surprised to see how little of Watson's original art there was for sale. And sadly, this is at least in part because Watson's widow had burned many of the pulp originals, believing them to be somewhat of an embarrassment to her husband's memory. But equally, such images were considered of no real value at the time, having served their commercial purpose. But at least we have the printed examples, and even if they do not do full justice to the vibrancy of his painting, they stand as a body of work which clearly shows the valuable contribution Emmett Watson made to the story of painted representational illustration in 20th century America.